Hey everyone, long-time lurker, first-time poster here. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but after what I just experienced, I need to put it into words. For context, I'm the CEO of a mid-sized logistics company. We handle shipping and distribution for dozens of businesses, and I've spent the last decade building this from the ground up. I like to think I run a tight ship, fair wages, decent benefits, and an open-door policy. I genuinely thought my employees were happy. But then complaints started trickling in. Not directly to me, of course. No one wants to tell the boss that things aren't working. It was whispers at networking events, an offhand comment from a friend who used our services, even a couple of anonymous Glassdoor reviews. The gist? Great company on paper, but the warehouse is a nightmare. That didn't sit right with me. If there was a problem, I needed to see it firsthand. So, I did something drastic. I went undercover. I took a week off from my official duties and became a temp worker at one of our busiest distribution centers. No one there had ever met me in person. I mostly dealt with upper management, so with a little hair dye, a pair of cheap work boots, and a borrowed name tag, shout out to my assistant for setting that up, I was just another guy looking for a paycheck. Day one was a wake-up call. The warehouse was chaotic. Packages stacked haphazardly, forklifts weaving between overwhelmed workers, and a constant nagging tension in the air. It wasn't dangerous exactly, but it was the kind of place where one wrong move could get someone hurt. And then there was my supervisor. Let's call him Dave. Dave took one look at me, new guy, clearly clueless, and immediately wrote me off. He barked out orders without explaining them, rolled his eyes every time I asked a question, and seemed to delight in making things harder than they needed to be. I watched him do the same to other workers, snapping at anyone who didn't move fast enough. But here's the part that really got to me. During my lunch break, I sat with a group of employees and just listened. No one held back because, well, I was just another temp. They talked about how turnover was sky high, how people quit after a few months because the workload was unbearable, and how management never seemed to care. They act like we're robots, one guy said, shaking his head. Doesn't matter if you're sick, if your kid has a school event, or if your back is killing you. You keep going, or they find someone who will. Another worker, a woman who had been there for over a year, just laughed bitterly. You think anyone in corporate even knows what it's like down here? She asked. They probably think we're happy just because the numbers look good on paper. I sat there, stomach twisting, because I was corporate. And I had no idea. And then, as if on cue, Dave strolled in. He took one look at us, scoffed, and muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Break's over. Back to work before I start handing out warnings." No one argued. They just stood up and trudged back to the floor. I followed, but my mind was racing. This wasn't just a bad supervisor. This was a broken system. And I was going to fix it. So there I was, back on the warehouse floor, trying to process everything I just learned. It wasn't just that Dave was a terrible supervisor, it was that the whole system seemed to be failing my employees. But I wasn't ready to blow my cover just yet. I needed to see more. The rest of the shift was brutal. The work itself wasn't the problem. I don't mind getting my hands dirty, but the pace. It was non-stop, no room for error, no breathing room. The pickers sprinted up and down the aisles, the forklift drivers barely had time to maneuver between shelves, and the loaders were drenched in sweat trying to keep up with the endless stream of packages. And Dave? He never lifted a finger. Just barked orders from the sidelines, occasionally berating people for moving too slow or messing up simple tasks. At one point, a guy named Luis, probably in his mid-40s, looked like he'd been here a while, dropped a box. It wasn't a big deal, nothing broke, but Dave saw it and immediately jumped on him. "Jesus, Luis, are you even trying?" Dave scoffed, arms crossed. "Or do you just like wasting everyone's time?" Luis muttered an apology and bent down to pick up the box. His hands were shaking. I couldn't keep my mouth shut. "Hey, it was an accident," I said before I could stop myself. "No harm done." Dave turned to me, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, new guy thinks he knows how this works." I held his gaze. "I just think there's no need to talk to people like that." For a second, I thought he was going to blow up. His face twitched, his jaw tightened. But then, instead of yelling, he smirked. "All right, hero," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, hard. "Let's see how fast you can load a full truck." I barely had time to react before he shoved a clipboard in my hands and pointed to the dock. "Those pallets? Get them onto that truck. 10 minutes. No screw-ups." The challenge was clear. He wanted to humiliate me. But here's the thing, he didn't know I used to do this kind of work. Before I ever owned a company, I spent years in warehouses, loading and unloading trucks, pulling double shifts just to make rent. So I got to work. I lifted, stacked, and secured each pallet as efficiently as I could, double-checking the weight distribution and making sure everything was strapped down properly. I wasn't the fastest guy out there, but I knew what I was doing. By the time I was done, I was sweating like crazy, but the truck was loaded. And not just loaded, it was perfect. Balanced, organized, exactly how it should be. Dave walked over, arms crossed, looking for something to criticize. When he didn't find anything, he just scoffed and muttered, "Lucky break," before walking away. But I noticed something else. A few of the other workers had been watching. Luis. A couple of the forklift drivers. Even the younger guys who'd barely spoken all day. And for the first time since I walked in, they didn't just look exhausted or frustrated. They looked curious. Like they were wondering, who the hell is this guy? That night, when the shift finally ended, I caught up with Luis in the parking lot. "Hey," I said. "How long have you worked here?" He sighed, rubbing his shoulder. 7 years. I whistled. "That long, huh?" "Yeah," he said with a dry chuckle. "Not sure if that makes me dedicated or just bad at making life choices." I leaned against my car. "You ever think about leaving?" Luis shrugged. "All the time. But I've got a family. Kids. The pay's not great, but it's steady." He hesitated. "At least it used to be." That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" Luis glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening. "Used to get overtime," he said. "Used to have more guys on each shift, too. But corporate keeps tightening budgets. Cutting corners. Now we're working harder for the same pay, and guys are quitting left and right." I frowned. "And management? They do anything to fix it." Luis let out a bitter laugh. "You mean Dave? He doesn't care. Long as the numbers look good, he's happy." I felt my jaw clench. I'd built this company to take care of people. To make sure they had stable jobs, decent pay, and a work environment that didn't break them. And now I was hearing that we were running people into the ground just to save a few bucks? I thanked Luis for talking to me, then sat in my car for a long time, staring at the warehouse. Tomorrow, I was going to push harder. Ask more questions. See exactly how deep this went. And then? I was going to burn it all down and rebuild it the right way. By the time I walked into the warehouse the next morning, I had one goal: find out just how deep the rot went. After what Luis told me, I couldn't stop thinking about how much had changed in my company without me realizing it. Overtime cuts? Staff reductions? A supervisor who treated his workers like garbage? This wasn't some isolated incident, this was systemic. And that meant one thing. It started with me. I had let this happen. Somewhere between board meetings, expansion plans, and watching profit margins, I'd lost sight of the people who actually kept this place running. Not anymore. I spent the morning doing what I did best, listening. I worked side by side with my team, picking orders, loading shipments, and striking up conversations when Dave wasn't breathing down our necks. Turns out, Luis wasn't the only one with grievances. One guy told me he'd been promised a raise after 6 months. That was over a year ago. A woman who'd been there for 3 years told me how they used to get shift rotations to ease the strain on their backs. Now? Same grueling work, no breaks. Even the new hires were exhausted. "I don't think I'm staying," one kid admitted while scanning barcodes. "I was told this job had good benefits. But all I see is people getting screwed over." Every story hit me like a gut punch. But the worst was yet to come. The breaking point. Lunchtime rolled around, and I noticed something weird. Some of the workers weren't eating. Just sitting there, sipping water or pretending to check their phones. I asked Luis about it. "Some of us skip lunch," he said casually. I frowned. "Why?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Because if we clock out for the full break, we fall behind." "And Dave? He loves calling people out for slowing down. I felt my blood pressure spike. So people are skipping meals just to keep up? Luis nodded. And it's worse at the end of the month when hours are tight. You haven't seen real hell yet. I didn't have to wait long. A few hours later, I saw it happen. One of the younger workers, maybe early 20s, short guy, lean build, was carrying a stack of boxes when he suddenly collapsed. Just dropped like a rag doll, the boxes spilling everywhere. For a second, no one moved. Then Luis and I ran over. "Hey man, you okay?" I asked, kneeling beside him. His face was pale, his breathing rapid. "I'm fine," he mumbled, trying to sit up. His hands were shaking. That's when Dave showed up. I swear to God, this man didn't even blink before saying, "If you can stand, you can work." I turned and stared at him. "Are you serious?" Dave scoffed. "What? He's fine." "He passed out," I shot back. "Probably dehydrated," Dave said with a shrug. "Not my problem. If people took care of themselves, we wouldn't have these issues." I had never wanted to punch someone so badly in my life. Instead, I turned back to the kid. "When was the last time you ate?" He hesitated. That was all the answer I needed. I stood up. "He needs a break." Dave laughed. "And you need to get back to work before you're out the door too, new guy." I clenched my jaw. I could have ended it right there. Told him who I was. Fired him on the spot. But I wasn't done yet. I had one last thing to do. That night, I made some calls. First, to my HR department. I wanted full employee records, salaries, turnover rates, overtime policies, everything. Then to my CO. I told him I wanted an immediate audit on warehouse management. No warnings. No time to cover anything up. And finally, I called the regional manager in charge of warehouse operations. He answered on the second ring. "Hey boss. What's up?" I got straight to the point. "How often do you check in on the warehouses?" There was a pause. Then a forced chuckle. "Oh, I get reports every week." "Reports aren't the same as being there," I said. "When's the last time you actually visited?" Another pause. A few months ago." I let that hang in the air for a moment. Then I said, "I want you at this warehouse tomorrow morning. 6 a.m. No excuses." I hung up before he could argue. Tomorrow, I was going to reveal who I was. And some people were not going to like what happened next. The next morning, I showed up early. Not as the temp worker. Not as new guy. But as myself, the CEO. No disguise. No pretense. Just me, standing in the middle of the warehouse floor as my regional manager walked in, looking half asleep. Dave strolled in a few minutes later, coffee in hand, completely unaware. "All right, he stopped mid-sentence when he saw me. I watched the color drain from his face as realization hit. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since I met him, he looked genuinely nervous. "Morning, Dave," I said evenly. Silence. Then, Luis walked in. He saw me, froze, then looked at Dave. The tension in the air was thick. I turned to the regional manager. "How much of what's happening here do you know about?" He stammered. Well. I cut him off. "Because I've spent the last 3 days working here, and let me tell you, it's a disaster." I glanced around at the workers, now gathering, watching. Some looked hopeful. Others skeptical. "People are overworked, underpaid, and skipping meals just to keep up," I said, voice firm. "Supervisors," I looked straight at Dave, "are running this place like a dictatorship. And corporate." I turned to the regional manager. "You're so out of touch that you let this happen right under your nose." Neither of them spoke. They knew there was nothing they could say. I let the silence stretch before I continued. "Effective immediately, Dave, you're fired." A murmur ran through the warehouse. Dave's face turned red. "You can't." "I can," I cut in. And I just did. I turned to the regional manager. "And you? I want a full report on how this got so bad, and if I don't like what I see, you're next." He nodded quickly, sweat beading on his forehead. Then I turned to the employees. "This ends today," I said. "We're bringing back overtime. We're hiring more staff. And we're making sure no one is treated like garbage in this company ever again. For the first time since I walked in, I saw something on their faces I hadn't seen before. Hope. This wasn't just about fixing a warehouse. This was about fixing everything. After firing Dave, I knew my job wasn't done. Fixing the warehouse wasn't just about getting rid of one bad manager, it was about rebuilding trust. I spent the rest of the day walking the floor, talking to employees. Some were hesitant, still unsure if anything would actually change. Others, like Luis, finally started opening up. "Look," he said, crossing his arms. "We've heard promises before. Things get better for a few weeks, then it's back to the same old mess." I nodded. "I get that. But this time, I'm staying involved. And if things don't change, I want you to tell me." Luis studied me for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. I turned to the group. "Starting next week, we're bringing back shift rotations, meal breaks are mandatory, and everyone's getting a pay review." There were murmurs, cautious but intrigued. "And Luis," I added, "I'd like you to step into a leadership role here. You've been looking out for your team more than your manager ever did. If you're up for it, I want you to help me turn this place around." His eyes widened. "Wait, are you serious?" I nodded. "Completely." For the first time, Luis smiled. This wasn't just about firing the wrong people. It was about promoting the right ones. And as I looked around at the workers, some still skeptical, but many now hopeful, I knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The next few days were intense. Firing Dave had sent a shockwave through the warehouse, and I could tell people were still trying to figure out if this was a temporary shakeup or a real turning point. I needed to prove it was the latter. So I rolled up my sleeves and worked. I spent every shift out on the floor, helping load shipments, checking inventory, and making sure everyone was actually getting their mandated breaks. It was like a completely different place without Dave breathing down people's necks. But problems don't disappear overnight. The first major test came when one of the regional managers, let's call him Mike, pulled me aside. "Look," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I get what you're trying to do, but all these changes? They're gonna cut into our bottom line." I folded my arms. "Go on." "If we bring back overtime, hire more staff, and slow things down for mandatory breaks, our costs are going to skyrocket." I exhaled slowly, keeping my temper in check. "And if we don't?" Mike hesitated. "Then, things will keep running as they have been." I locked eyes with him. "You mean the way they've been running, while turnover keeps climbing? While morale is in the dirt? While good employees are skipping meals just to keep up?" Mike looked uncomfortable. "That's just the nature of the business." "No," I said firmly. "That's the nature of bad leadership." I pulled out my phone and showed him a report my HR team had compiled over the last few days. Employee turnover had increased by 35% in the last 2 years. Overtime costs had actually gone down, not because we were more efficient, but because fewer people were willing to stay. Customer complaints about late deliveries had doubled. "These numbers," I said, tapping the screen, "they're what's actually killing our bottom line. Not giving people a lunch break." Mike didn't argue. He just sighed. "So what's the plan?" I smiled. "Glad you asked." Step 1 was staffing up. I told HR to immediately start rehiring for all the vacant positions that had been left open to cut costs. Within a week, we had new hires going through training, taking the pressure off the rest of the team. Step 2. Fixing wages. I worked with finance to approve raises for the employees who had been strung along for months or years, without the raises they were promised. Step 3. Leadership changes. I sat down with Luis and officially promoted him to shift supervisor. He was hesitant at first. "I've never been a manager before," he admitted. "You've already been doing the job," I told him. "The only difference is now you'll get paid for it." He thought about that for a second, then nodded. "Okay. But I'm not going to treat people the way Dave did." "That's why I picked you," I said. We also replaced Mike. I had given him the benefit of the doubt, but he wasn't willing to change. So I let him go and brought in someone who actually cared about people, not just numbers. The effects were almost immediate. Employees actually looked less exhausted. Turnover slowed. And the work? It didn't suffer. If anything, it improved, because happy, well-rested employees made fewer mistakes and worked better, not just faster. The most surprising thing? Even profits started climbing. Customers noticed the difference in service, and we were able to retain employees instead of constantly hiring and training new ones. Turns out, treating people like human beings is good for business. A few weeks after the changes took effect, Luis stopped me at the end of his shift. "Hey boss," he said, a little awkwardly. I raised an eyebrow. "Boss?" He chuckled. "Guess I gotta get used to that." Then he got serious. "I just wanted to say thanks. Not just for the promotion, but for actually giving a damn. We've had people come through here, making promises, but you actually meant it." That hit me hard. Because the truth was, I hadn't meant it before. Not intentionally, but I had let myself believe that reading reports and looking at spreadsheets told me everything I needed to know about my company. I was wrong. I needed to see it. Feel it. And if I had never walked onto that warehouse floor, I never would have known just how broken things had become. I shook Luis's hand. "You and the team are the reason this place runs," I said. "I'm just here to make sure you actually get what you deserve." For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was actually leading my company. And I wasn't going to stop now. A month after the changes, I walked into the warehouse, not as a temp, not undercover, but as the CEO. This time, the energy was different. People weren't dragging their feet. They were talking, laughing, working together. Luis was leading with confidence. New hires were settling in. Even customer reviews had improved. And Dave? Gone and forgotten. I gathered the team for a quick meeting. "I want to thank you all," I said. "Not just for your hard work, but for being honest, even when it wasn't easy. This company only succeeds if you do, and I won't forget that again." For a second, there was silence. Then someone started clapping. And just like that, everyone joined in. I smiled. I had come here expecting to find problems. Instead, I found people worth fighting for. And I wasn't going to let them down again.